Hey everyone, welcome to another Python video, and in this video I will explain how decorator works. And I will do this in 5 steps so that it makes more sense. So if you want to know the definition, in Python, a decorator is a little wrapper you put around a function so that whenever you use that function, it does something extra without changing the function's own code. Now, this definition may not make enough sense, and that's the reason I want to explain decorator in 5 steps because to understand decorator, you must understand these concepts. So, function definition, function parameters, return values, function objects, nested functions, returning functions, decorator syntax. So, let's get started with the first step. So, the step number 1. Functions are objects. Now, what does that mean and how does this work? Okay, so functions can be stored in variables and passed around. So let's first create a basic function to understand functions are objects. So in order to do this, we will create a basic function and then we will see from that function how can we create a function object. So let's create the function right here. Let's say I have a function called recipe. No parameters, just a basic function. I'm going to say print, this is my recipe. Okay, very basic function. And I can call this function recipe. And obviously if I run it, it will show that this is my recipe. However, if I just write recipe without using the parentheses, that is called a function object. So this is a function object. If you try to just use a function object, that basically means you have your function, but it is not getting called. That means this will not execute the function and it will not show you any prints. If I just click on run, it doesn't do anything. So this is your function object when you write a function without the parentheses. Okay, a function object basically means it basically holds the code that you have inside, but it will not execute this. It will only execute when you put the parentheses. So using that function object, I can pass it to another, for example, a variable. Okay, so recipe means this is a function object. A recipe that hasn't been used, that means, as I said, the code hasn't been executed. Basically, it's just holding the recipe for you. Now what we can do is you can give it to another code or rename this. Okay, so what I can do is I can put it in a variable, let's say my recipe equal to that recipe. So that means my recipe is also a function object. It is a function object, which is nothing but this function, but it will not execute this. If you try to print either recipe or my recipe, you're not going to see the function. Okay, it will just tell you the memory location where this function exists. It will not show you the code inside the function, so it will not execute this. So the question is, how do we then execute the code? So to execute the code, all you have to do is write my recipe with parentheses. So my recipe with parentheses basically means the recipe function. So now it will execute. So now if I click on run, you will see this is my recipe. So that is the idea of function object. So when you write a function without a parenthesis, we call this a function object. And I can pass this function object in a new variable. And then when I write the variable with parentheses, it again becomes the actual function, which is basically the recipe function. And that's the step number one, you need to understand that functions are objects. So hopefully this makes sense. Now let's go to the second step, functions inside functions. Okay, so it is possible that you can define a function inside another, and we call them the inner function. And the inner functions can be called by the outer one. And this is where you start seeing the wrapping behavior. So let's go ahead and do step two. So this was step one. We understood how function object works. Step two. So here I'm going to create a function. Let's call this def outer. So we have an outer function, and inside I have an inner function. And I'm going to have a print statement. I'm going to say something like, okay, I am the inner function. Now, if I call the inner from here, will this work? It will not work. Okay, you will get a name error because the inner function, the scope of this function is only under the outer. So you can't call it from outside. It will give you an error, which is a name error because Python doesn't understand this function outside of this outer function. So we can't do this. Now, what if I call the outer? Will it call the inner? No, it will not call the inner because you never call the inner function inside the outer. So what we have to do is we have to call the inner function from the outer function. So that means when you call the outer function, obviously these two lines will not work unless you call the function inner. So that's what we did here. So basically when I call the outer function, it's calling the inner function. Okay, so now it will work. So if I now click on run, you will see that it says I'm the inner function, even though I call the outer function. Since outer function doesn't have anything except the inner, it will just execute the inner function. Okay, so that is the idea of function inside a function. Okay, step number two. Let's now try to understand step number three, functions returning functions. And let's see how this works. So a function can return another function. So let's see how we can do this. Step three. So for this, I'm going to create another function. Let's say def outside. And then I'm going to have another inner function. And let's say here I'm going to say hello. Let's call this inside. Hello from the inside. Okay, so now I'm going to do something different. So first of all, I'm going to return the inside. Now be careful that here I'm returning a function object. So I am returning a function object. So that means when you call the outside function, it will just return the inside function object, not the inside function that will get executed. In the step two, I call the inner function. Here I'm saying return inside. So it's nothing but returning the inside function object. So again, function object means it will not do anything unless you put the parenthesis, right? So that means when I call the outside, it's basically returning the inside function object. Okay, so it will not do anything. So what I can do is I can create a variable just like the way I did it in my step one. I'm going to say something like my function equal to outside function. But remember, outside function is just returning the inside function object. Okay, so if you try to print my function, you will just see the location of the inside function. It's not going to do anything. So for example, if I say print my function and run the code, you will see it's showing the memory location of the inside function. Okay, so how do I make the my function to work? All I have to do is write my function with parentheses. So my function with parentheses is nothing but the inside function because you use the parentheses. Here you did not, so it becomes a function object. But when you saved the outside function, you're basically saving the inside function object in my function. And when you write my function with parentheses, it will basically just execute that function, right? So if I now run this, you will see that it says hello from the inside. So that's the third thing to understand while working on decorator. So functions returning functions. Okay. All right, so we're getting closer. So now step number 4, passing functions to other functions. So it is possible that functions can also take another function as input called a callback. So let's see how this works. Step 4. So let's create a function. Let's call this def greetings. Okay. And here I will have a parameter called func. And I'm going to have a print statement. And here I'm going to say something like, okay, this is the first task. Now, at this point, we don't know func parameter is what. Is this a string? Is this an int, float? I don't know anything about this func. However, if I write func with parentheses, I know that func is a function object. So that means when you are passing an argument, when you call function greetings, you must pass a function object so that it can treat this as a function after printing this is my first task. So that means I need to have a function object in order to work with the function greetings. So let's create a separate function. I'm going to say def say hello. And inside I'm going to say hello there. Actually, let's say this is the main task. Main task. And I'm going to call this task. Okay, so we created a function and that name is task. We have another function greetings that takes a parameter, and that parameter is basically a function object. I know this because I can see it says func with parentheses, so I know that func is a function object. That means in order to work with greetings, I must pass a function object because it is expecting a function object. So what is a function object that we have? We created a function called task. That means if I just pass task, my task is a function object. That means instead of using func, I'm going to use the task function object. And that will do the trick. So what will happen here? Func is basically the task. And when you write func with parentheses, that basically means the task with the parentheses. That means it will execute this. This is the main task. But since I have a print statement before I call this function, it will first say this is the first task and this is the main task. So now if I run this, you will notice it says this is the first task and this is the main task. Okay, so basically we are trying to wrap the function with another print statement. So your original function is not affected. You're just adding an extra line of information before this function gets executed. Okay, so you're getting there. We have one more step. We did step 4. Now we will do the final step to understand the decorator. Right? Step 5. And here is the decorator thing that we can understand. Making your first decorator. Step 5. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna first create a function. Let's call this my decorator. And this will take a function object, just like in step 4. And then we're gonna create another function, and this is my wrapper function. And this is the function that will wrap my actual function. Okay, I'm gonna say print, and I'm gonna say before the function runs, do something. So my idea here is that before I execute my function that I would like to work with, I am going to add this print statement. And then my original function will start working here. After that, I'm going to have another print. I'm going to say after the function runs, do something. So I'm not just executing my function, but I'm adding some extra features as well using the wrapper function. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the wrapper object. So, okay. So a few things happening here. Let's explain this so that it makes sense. We have a function. So how many functions we have and how many functions objects we have here? We have a function called myDecorator. We have another function wrapper. We have another function func. There are two function objects. One is func as a parameter, and we are returning the wrapper function object. So func is a function object, wrapper is a function object, func with parentheses is a function, wrapper is a function, myDecorator is a function. So 3 functions and 2 functions objects are working here. So let's see how can I make it work. All right. So now I'm going to use the decorator signature, which is the at. I'm going to say at my decorator. Now, what does this do? I will explain that in a minute, but first, let's write the syntax. So I'm going to write at my decorator. I'm going to call, I'm going to create a function because I don't have an actual functions. I just have func with parentheses. But in order for me to work with my decorator, I must pass a function object, which we don't have. And this is what we're going to make. I'm going to say def main function. So this is my main function. And the main function will do the main tasks. I'm going to say print. This is the main task. So the idea is that before I start working on my main task, I will do something before the function runs. And when this function is done, I will do something else. Okay, that is the idea. Okay, so we created my main function. This is my main function. And that what I'm going to do is I'm going to just call my main function. So main function. And that's it. So the my decorator at my decorator does something, and that's what I'm going to explain to you. But first, let's see what happens. So what should happen is it should say before the function runs, do something. And this is the main task. And after the function runs, again, do something. So if I click on run, this is what you're going to see here. Um, since I have another print statement, this is the main task. Let's just change this message. Let's say this is the main objective. All right. Okay, so if you notice here, you'll notice first it says before the function runs, do something. And this is the main objective. So this is my main function, main objective. So before the main objective, I'm going to do something. After I'm done with the main objective, I'm going to also do something without making any changes to my main function. So the main function will work as it is. Getting help from the wrapper allows me to add something before and after without affecting my original function. And that is the idea of my decorator. Now the question is, how does the my decorator at my decorator works? So in order to understand this, I'm going to first disable this to understand what does at my decorator does. Okay. So what I have to do is I'm going to create a variable, let's say main func. Okay. So main func, obviously my goal is to call my decorator function and then pass a function object, right? And then the main func should be written as main func with a parenthesis. Okay. Just like the way we did it in step 4. But I need to have my main function as well. So let's create my main function again. So def main function, parenthesis, print. This is the main objective. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my decorator. My decorator must have a function object, and I'm going to pass that main function object. So I'm going to say main function. And then I'm going to call the main func with parentheses. So basically, when you write at my decorator is basically does this for you. Okay. So this is same as saying at my decorator. So the benefit is I don't have to write this. Instead, I can just write at my decorator, which automatically does this for you. So what you're doing, you're calling my decorator, passing a function object, which is the main function that we created. And then what we're going to happen is it will return the wrapper function object. So the main func is nothing but the wrapper function object. But if you just use the wrapper function object, it can't do anything, right? Because in order for the wrapper function to get executed, I have to put the parentheses. And that's what I did here. I wrote main func with parentheses so that it calls or executes the wrapper function, which will first do this print, then calls the function, and then prints this. So that is the purpose of writing at my decorator, which exactly does this for you. So if I now run this, you will see it does the same thing. Okay. Before the function runs, do something. This is the main objective. And after the function runs, do something. But instead of writing these, we will write this. And that is the idea of decorator. So what does the decorator do? So it adds some features before the main function gets executed. And this is great for adding logging, timing, or authentication steps around existing functions without modifying their code. So we're not going to modify the main function. The main function will stay as it is. But every time we want to do, for example, a login and do something and then log out, I can use the decorator. So it'll do something before my actual function. So let's say this is your login, this is your log out, and in between you have your original function which does something every time. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Thank you for watching, guys. Bye.